If you're a facilities manager at a university, you know students rely on the cafeteria for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and the occasional late-night snack. So when a dishwasher breaks down and dirty plates pile up, the mess hall can turn messy in the blink of an eye. Enter Granger. With over 1 million industrial-grade products and fast delivery, the product you need now is never far away. So you can turn that dishwasher back into a lean, clean washing machine. Call, click Granger.com, or just stop by. Granger, for the ones who get it done.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. Every Friday night, 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. I'm your host, Ed Opperman. I'm a private investigator, a digital forensic investigator, and I also have a blog called the Opperman Report. By the way, keep an eye out for me because coming up in, I guess we got March coming up, right? I'm going to be on John B. Wells' Caravan to Midnight on his new internet thing he's doing. And then in April, I'm going to be on the Danny Bonaducci show from Danny Bonaducci from, what was that? That TV show. Anyway, there's a radio show now. Okay, tonight's guest. I'm very, very excited. I've been reading up on all this stuff. We're doing a show about the Black Dahlia murders, okay? And it's just incredible stuff. And I've been watching all the videos. Yeah, Partridge Family, Danny Bonaducci. I've been watching all the videos and stuff on the Black Dahlia murder. But we have Steve Hodel, who's a private investigator also. He's a retired homicide detective from L.A., and he's an author of several books. The first one was called, I don't know if I have them in order here, but one was The Black Dahlia Avenger, The True Story. Then he did The Black Dahlia Avenger 2, presenting the follow-up investigation and further evidence linking Dr. George Hill Hodel, who was his dad, to Los Angeles' Black Dahlia and other 1940s lone woman murders. He's also the author of Most Evil, which is Avenger, Zodiac, and the further serial murders of Dr. George Hill Hodel. He wrote A Genius for Murder, which is a play in 3 acts, and then he wrote Black Dahlia, Avenger, A Genius for Murder. And all these books are up on the Opperman Report, so if you want to pick up these books, you can go over there and click on the links over there. Take you straight to Amazon.com. Real quick, next week, I'm really excited, we have Scott Michaels, who is the film director of a movie called 6 Degrees of Helter Skelter. And he runs those dearly departed tours. In fact, he might even know Steve Hodel, because I know on one of his videos, he did a video about the dearly departed tours, and one of the big segments on there was about the Black Dahlia murder. He's also the owner of the website findthedeath.com. Steve, are you there?
I'm here. Good to be with you, Ed.
Dude, thank you so much for coming on. I'm really, really excited about this. Can you tell us about yourself and about your history, and then we'll get into the whole story about how you discovered this stuff?
Okay. Yeah, basically my background was born and raised in L.A., joined the Navy at 17, did 4 years in the Navy, got out, and basically with a military background and a nice clean WASP, I did what every other one did, and that was join up with LAPD, kind of right from central casting. I came on in 63 with LAPD, and I would spend the next 24 years with them, 5 years uniform patrol here in L.A., and then we went to detectives and basically worked all the tables, robbery, sex abuse, juvenile, auto theft, burglary, and then quickly went to homicide table and stayed there basically in Hollywood Division. Back east, you call them precincts, I think, but out here we call them divisions. And so I went to Hollywood Division and worked homicide for the next 14 years, 300 murder investigations I investigated. Had one of the highest clearance rates on the department. It wasn't just me. I had some really good partners back then in the 60s. And basically retired after just short of 24 years. Got my license, PI license, and basically became a criminal defense investigator for the next, up until now, so it's been another 25 years. So 25 for the prosecution, and I guess you could say 25 for the defense, so a nice balanced palette there. And basically in 1980, 88, 89, I was part of that mass exodus. I had two small boys and wanted to get them out of the mean streets of L.A. So we moved north to Washington, where I raised them, put them through middle school, high school, and started doing PI work up there, as I say, mostly criminal.
Hey, real quick, Hodel Investigations. I couldn't find a website for that. Do you have a website?
No, basically I haven't done it for, I still have kept my license active, but I've been full-time writing and investigating these cases. So I'm not really that active anymore, even though I kept my license active.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's just been too much to do the writing and the investigating on these cases and try and you know how it is. You got to be at the beck and call of the attorney when that phone rings, and I just didn't have the time to do that.
Yeah, I know it, bro. I know it. Okay, I just wrote a book. I wrote a book myself, so I'm trying to, get where you are. Okay, but go ahead. Keep telling us about your career and stuff.
Okay, so I'm working criminal defense up there, investigating cases in Bellingham, Washington, which is a beautiful town, kind of the last stop before you get to Canada. And boys are, go through high school, and then basically I wind up getting a divorce up there in '95, and I get a phone call on May the 17th, 1999, and it's from my father's young wife. And she says, your father is they were in San Francisco. She says he's collapsed. The paramedics are here. They just pronounced him dead. Come down. So I jump on a plane, fly down, do all the things you have to do with the passing of a father. She's in shock. They were married 30 years. She was 40 years his junior, but they were married 30 years. And basically, she was
real
suicidal.
Quick, is she still alive?
Yes.
Okay.
And her name was June, and so basically, sitting there and taking care of her, and she hands over a book of private photographs that Dad collected, a small book that he'd been kept with him for 60 years, and that really started my investigation. But probably before we jump into that, maybe it might be good to give your listeners an idea of just who. In my books, I go into heavy biographics on my father, because to understand these crimes and what unfolded, you really have to understand George Hodel. And
yeah, that's a great idea, because I've been reading your stuff all day long, your blog and your website. And by the way, what's the name of your website? SteveHodel.com?
Yes.
Okay. There is an amazing amount of information in there in the frequently asked questions section. It's like a real murder file, a murder investigation file that you would get in a death penalty trial. This is incredible work. So SteveHodel.com. You got to go down there and check that out. And I heard all about your father. He's a fascinating guy. So so let's start from the beginning about your father as a young man and how he was a genius. Okay. He was smarter than Einstein.
Yeah, he was really amazing guy. Born in L.A. in 1907, downtown L.A. His parents were Russian Jews that came over from Kiev, which is in today's headlines, and Odessa. My grandfather was from Odessa. My grandmother was from Kiev. And they went through Paris, lived there for a while. She was a dentist, which in 1900 was amazing for a woman to be a dentist. They came through Ellis Island and came out west to Los Angeles and got here in about 1904, 1905. Dad, George Hodel, their son, was born in 1907. At about age 7, he was quickly identified as a musical genius, piano. He was taking lessons, and he quickly became a music prodigy. He was playing his own concerts at the Shrine Auditorium at the age of 9 and 10, beating out all of these adults in competition. And so he did that, and then a few years later, he was identified as an intellectual genius. He actually had an IQ of 186, 1 point above Einstein. That skips a generation, by the way, just so you know. Anyway, so he's highly gifted. He gets the highest scores in public schools here that ever attained in 1920, in the 1913 or 14. He enters Caltech at the age of 14, graduates from high school, enters Caltech, which is a very prestigious university out here, goes there for a year, has an affair with one of the professor's wives, who gets pregnant. A big scandal. She's forced to, obviously, it breaks up her marriage.
But wait a second, he was 14 years old, wasn't he?
He was 14 years old.
Wow.
He has an affair with this professor's wife. So not only is he intellectually precocious and a musical genius, but he's also sexually precocious. And she goes east, breaks up her marriage, and has the child, which is a girl, which he aptly names Folly. Young George, teenager, follows her back, says, "I love you, I want to marry you," and the woman says, "George," she laughs in his face and says, you're just a child yourself. Get out of my life. Go away." So he comes back. Of course, he's forced out of Caltech, and he starts driving cab here in L.A., out of the Biltmore downtown L.A. with another guy by the name of William H. Parker, who's driving cab and going to law school. Ironically, Parker will decades later, become LAPD's greatest chief of police. Anyway, they were driving cab together back in the mid-20s. He gets a job as a crime reporter for one of the LA newspapers, the LA Record, which was one of the big papers back then. And he's riding around, of course, this is Prohibition. So he's riding around with the Vice Squad cops, and they're kicking doors, speakeasies, and they're arresting the judge with a young blonde, and he's taking names and publishing them in the newspaper the next day, tabloid stuff. Then he graduates and starts riding around with LAPD homicide guys. And again, more tabloid stories, the bloody ace of spade next to the body, that sort of thing. And then he starts double dating. He's still a teenager. He starts double dating with a guy named John Huston. Well, John Huston will later become the famous film director, but at that time his fame was he was the son of Walter Huston, who his father was a very famous actor, A-list actor back in Hollywood. And so they started double dating with a couple of women by the name of Dorothy and Emilia. And George and Dorothy were dating, and John and Emilia. And then a few weeks or a month into the double dating, they switched, and John fell in love with Dorothy. And they run off to New York, to Greenwich Village. They get married, and they go back east and start living life in Greenwich Village. And George and Emilia look at each other and I guess kind of shrug their shoulders and say, "I guess it's you and me, babe." And she gets pregnant, Emilia. So Dad decides he's going to go into medicine. And their son, they have a son born in 28 by the name of Duncan, who will eventually, when I come along later, he'll be my half-brother, of course. Anyway, they go north to Berkeley and Dad begins schooling there at pre-med, 4 years. He gets a job driving yellow cab up in San Francisco, goes across the bay to UCSF, the medical school, gets his medical degree for another 4 years, 5 years. And among his many gifts, of all these gifts, he's also got perfect eye-hand coordination. So his professors at medical school are vying for him to be their assistant in surgery because he's such a natural skilled surgeon. And he graduates. Just before he graduates, he has another affair with another woman, with another Dorothy, not the one we were talking about earlier. And she gets pregnant, and he has a daughter in 35, just before he graduates, by the name of Tamar. So he's got Duncan and Tamar and the two women, and he graduates and decides he needs, I guess he's way ahead of the 60s, he decides he needs some space. And he takes off and becomes a surgeon for a logging camp, the sole surgeon. And this is we're now into like 1937, 36, 37. And he becomes a surgeon for a logging camp in Arizona. He becomes a doctor for the Hopi and Navajo reservations in New Mexico and Arizona, and basically does that for about a year and a half, 2 years. Then he comes back to Los Angeles in the late 30s and joins up with the LA County Health Department, specializing in venereal disease control. Dorothy, who had married John Huston, the original Dorothy, their marriage breaks up after 7 years. She comes back to L.A., hooks back up with George, and my older brother Michael is born in 39. I come along in 41. My younger brother Kelly comes along in 42. So there's the three brothers born, and Dad's quickly rises to the top of L.A. County Health Department with all of his natural gifts and intellect, and becomes the head of L.A. County. He becomes the venereal disease control officer for all of L.A. County Health Department. And at that point, he decides he needs a home befitting his prestigious position, and he buys a house in 1945 in Hollywood, and it's a Frank Lloyd Wright Jr. home. It's a Mayan temple, and you can see it on my website. There are lots of different photos of it, and it's been in a lot of different movies, The Aviator, L.A. Confidential, a whole bunch of others, and it's this literally a Mayan temple, stone temple in the heart of Hollywood. So we all move in there in the mid 1945, and he starts.
Wait a second, Steve. Can you give out the address of that house so that people can Google it on Google Images and get an idea of what that place looks like? Because it
Sure.
really is drastic. A place to grow up and live in, and you can it has a really eerie feeling about it as well.
Yeah, the address is 5121 Franklin Avenue, and that's Los Angeles or Hollywood, California, and it's right at the corner of Normandy and Franklin in Hollywood, 5121 Franklin Avenue. And it's a lot of looky-loos. It's lots of people. The current owner has put up a gate now out front because they had so many people come up and door knock it, and it's so unusual.
Yeah,
and it's a historic monument in Hollywood now. It's been named as a historical site because it's so unique. And it was built by Lloyd Wright, who's the son of Frank Lloyd Wright, the famous architect. But Lloyd Wright was famous in his own right. So we're living there. It's the mid-40s. We're living there. Dad's, of course, Mom's connections because she was married so long to John Huston. A lot of film people. Mom was a screenwriter. So lots of movie people were friends with my father, and he had all kinds of connections in the Hollywood filmdom as well as all over, power politics. And, of course, one of the things you need to know about this story is that L.A. back in the 40s was very corrupt. It was a true-life L.A. Confidential. And half the cops were on the take back then and, committing everything from murder down to, thefts, major thefts, controlling vice in the city, lots and lots of corruption. And so basically, from there, Dad, we're all living there and lots of parties, lots of Hollywood parties, beautiful women. Of course, as a kid growing up there, I was there from age 4 to 9. And basically, for me, it was, paradise. I mean, it was nothing but fun for me and my brothers, because we were kind of like the three little princes running around the house, with Dad being the king and Mom being the queen. Mom was very beautiful. And all of these interesting people, artists, a lot of surrealists. I don't know how many of your listeners are familiar with Man Ray. He was a famous surrealist photographer who was close friends. He was our family photographer. And that will become as we get into the story later on, surrealism will become a very important part to the crimes themselves, as we'll discover. But so basically, Dad is, we're having all of these interesting people coming and parties, and then fast forward to 1949, and there's a knock on the door, and it's LAPD, and I say, Dr. Hodel, and he says, yes. I say, LAPD juvenile, you're under arrest for incest. So it turns out that you remember I mentioned Tamar, who was born
Right.
in 35. Well, she was now 14 and living with us for the summer of 49. She was living down at the house with us, and she ran away. She was gone 3 days. Of course, Dad had to make a missing. Cops pick her up. They find her, and they're about to bring her home. And they said, "Well, why did you run away?" And she says, "Well, because my life is so complicated and terrible." And they said, "What do you mean?" She says, and then she discloses the fact that she'd had sexual relations with her father, and had since she was 11, had been oral sex and child, basically incest. So she's placed, of course, immediately in juvenile hall for protective custody. Dad's arrested. He gets an attorney by the name of Jerry Geisler, who was a very famous attorney back in the 40s and 50s. He was kind of the Johnny Cochran of his day, and all the stars and celebrities used him, mostly in sex crimes, and he was winning all of his cases. So big news, and you can see these articles and stuff on my website. And basically, Dad's arrested and has a trial, 3-week trial, a lot of testimony, and they do a pretty good job of painting Tamar with they call her a liar. She's a pathological liar, and they paint her with that brush. And even though the evidence is overwhelming that he did the sex acts,
let me interrupt you.
Comes back.
Weren't there 3 witnesses?
Well, I was just going to say, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
The jury comes back with a kind of a 45-minute O.J. verdict and said not guilty. And this is despite the fact that we had 3 adult witnesses present in the bedroom during the acts, actually participated, involved in it. And he also, Dad made, which were printed in the newspapers, he made confessions to the crime. He said, I don't know, some of his actual statements that were published in the newspaper were, I don't know if I'm being hypnotized or somebody's hypnotizing me. This whole thing is like a dream. But, if I'm here and this is real, then these things must have happened. And basically he says, my daughter and I have been studying sex, since she was a child or small child, on and on, basically coughing out tacit admissions. And the witnesses, so who were present, but despite all of that, like I say, we'll later find out once we get into the DA's secret files. We'll find out there was apparently a $15,000 payoff,
okay,
which of course back then was a huge amount of money.
But now, were the witnesses arrested? If the witnesses were there participating, weren't they arrested?
Well, they agreed to testify. So they apparently they made a deal to if we can have your testimony. So they did testify against him, but then at the prelim, but then at the actual trial, one of them refused to testify because basically she was threatened. Dad threatened to kill her. So they clammed up, and it added complication. The other witness testified, but still, they go figure.
Yeah, there was a trial though. There was an actual trial on the molestation, and he was found not guilty.
3-week trial. He was found not guilty despite all of the evidence. And so that's it. Now we're up into early 1950s.
Well, no, we're coming to a perfect time for a break. We're coming up to a break. This is going to be a short break, around 2 or 3 minutes. We're with Steve Hodel, who is the son of Dr. George Hodel. And Steve is convinced that Steve's a homicide detective. He's a private investigator. He's an author. And he's convinced that his doctor, George Hill Hodel, is the Zodiac killer. And he's laid out a case that I think could get a death penalty conviction easily. So we'll be right back after this with a private investigator and author, Steve Hodel. He's written the Black Dahlia Avenger, Most Evil Avenger, Zodiac. Even the Zodiac is involved and further serial murders of Dr. George Hill Hodel. We'll be right back after this with Steve Hodel. Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. I just want to, before we get back to my guest, Steve Hodel, who's the author of Black Dahlia Avenger and Black Dahlia Avenger 2, and has a website called stevehodel.com with all of this information. It's incredible information on the Black Dahlia murders. I just want to remind everybody that it's a listener-sponsored station. We have no corporate sponsorships, so if you like what you're hearing and you want to support the station, you got to visit freedomslips.com and you want to click on the donate button. Real quick, I'd also like to thank my producer, Ann, for all her hard work every week. We worked all day long today getting the show together, and she works like a full-time job every week for this show, and also Christoph Moses, who helps us with all the YouTube videos and getting up all that stuff like that. And we have a new guy joining the team, Keith Davis, who's a really interesting guy he's digging up these guests. I think he helped us find Steve Hodel tonight, and our guest last week, Dave McGowan. He helped us find him as well. So Keith Davis just joined the team, and he's helping out, volunteering his time and efforts as well. Back to Steve Hodel, we were just talking about how your father was arrested, had a 3-week trial for molesting his daughter, and then was found not guilty.
Right. So just to close the circle on Dad, so we can get into the crimes themselves and let your listeners get an idea of how this all comes together. So Dad, after the trial, he's still in town for about 3 or 4 weeks, and he decides suddenly to split, and he takes off and he leaves the United States quickly, and he relocates to Hawaii, which at the time in 1950 was a territory. He meets and marries a wealthy Filipino woman, moves on from Hawaii after about a year or two. He becomes a psychiatrist, goes to Manila, where he's home based, gets into market research, and opens up in 20 different countries offices, becomes the largest market researcher in Asia, becomes the leading expert in Asia on market researching, with his also his prestigious degree as a psychiatrist backing that. They have 4 children. He's married and divorced in 5 years, has a bunch of affairs, and then winds up with meeting June in 1969, who's his office manager in Tokyo, Japan. They get married and will stay married for the next 30 years. She's 40 years his junior, younger than I am. So he has a prosperous market research firm throughout Asia. Decides in 1990 to come back to the United States after 35, 40 years absence. June and he relocate to San Francisco, downtown Bush Street. They get a penthouse in the 39th floor downtown, and he contacts me and says, I'm back in town. And we start seeing each other on a regular basis. So for the last 10 years of his life, we become very close, and he now has 11 children by 5 different women, and has led this incredible life. And basically, I come down to San Francisco, he comes up to Bellingham, Washington. We become quite close, and then I get the phone call, which we talked about earlier, where he dies of a heart attack at age 91. Basically, maybe we should jump into a little summary on the Black Dahlia murder. Should we do that for you?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, tell everybody what happened, who Elizabeth Short was, and all about that.
Okay, so the Black Dahlia was one of LA's most notorious unsolved murders, and the reason it was because of the absolute horror of the crime itself and the combination of things that came together. So it's January 15th, 1947. It's a cold winter morning here in Los Angeles. A woman is walking her, or in a stroller, pushing her 3-year-old daughter to market on that morning. She's in the Leimert Park area of LA, which is about 5 or 6 miles south of Hollywood. They're going down the street, and she looks over in this vacant lot, and she sees what she thinks is a mannequin, like cut in half, the top half and the bottom half. And she looks over and says, "Oh my goodness, that's going to scare the children on their way to school on their bicycles and stuff." So she goes down about a block, door knocks, nobody home. She goes down to another house, 39th and Norton. She's on Norton, and she door knocks that, and it's the residence of a Dr. Walter Bailey. And she meets the wife, and she says, "Can I use your phone? I want to call the police and tell them there's a mannequin." And so she does. She calls it in. Cops respond, get there, and it's not a mannequin. It's a young woman, a Jane Doe, completely nude, perfectly surgically bisected at the waist in half, carefully posed near the sidewalk in this large vacant lot. Signs of torture to the body, burn marks, cigarette burn marks. I'm not going to go into all the details, but it was just horrific. The autopsy would later show that it was probably one of the worst torture murders that has ever occurred. The veteran homicide detectives that respond are in shock. They've never seen anything so brutal. She's a Jane Doe. They get her fingerprints. They send them back to the FBI, and within a day, they get a name and an identity. And her name is Elizabeth Short. She's 22. She's from Medford, Massachusetts. And she basically came out to Hollywood during the war in the early 40s, 42, 43, to basically meet Lieutenant Wright, fall in love, and hopefully live happily ever after. She got involved in the shark-infested waters out here, and kind of pretty naive, and dated guys and stuff. And basically, she wound up, at 39th and Norton in this horrific crime. So they start checking around and researching and tracing her background and stuff. And while they're doing that, well, the other thing is that the name, Black Dahlia, one of the newspaper guys talks to some of the military guys that saw her in a pharmacy where she would go in for sodas in Long Beach, which is just south of L.A. And the guys in there gave her the nickname the Black Dahlia. There was a movie that had come out the summer before called The Blue Dahlia, which was a famous noir film with Alan Ladd and Veronica Lake. And so they kind of did a spin-off on that and called her the Black Dahlia. So you've got the name, this mysterious name. You've got this horrific, murder. And all of the 4 or 5 major newspapers in L.A. went ballistic on it, and they went, I guess what we would say today is viral headlines. They were all trying to outdo each other for scoops on the crime and stuff. So,
Wait, can you tell the audience how they notified her mother of the death?
Yeah, that's a little distorted, but it's one of the things that's about this is there's so much myth and fiction, and a lot of hack writers that came out with stuff that, one of my hardest jobs was to separate the truth from fact from fiction in my investigation. But the story you're talking about is that basically the city editor, a guy named James Richardson, supposedly had one of his guys, reporters, get on the phone and call the mother and say, get as much information as you can, talk to her, and tell her she won a beauty contest, and get as much information you can before you tell her what. So he lays it out, and the mother's all excited about her daughter winning a beauty contest. And then he says, okay, now tell her the truth after they get all the information. And he says, yeah, well, she's also been murdered. So, that's kind of one of the brutal things. I think it was a bit distorted. I don't think it actually played out exactly like that. But the truth is that she had won a beauty contest. She was working at at Camp Cook, and she was actually had won a contest a year earlier. So it was not a total lie. It was,
Let me ask you another question that it might be myth.
Sure.
But I had heard that in the movie Pretty Woman, in the scene where Richard Gere is going up that fire escape, that in that apartment where Pretty Woman, I forget the name of the actress, where she lived, that was the actual apartment of Elizabeth Short.
I'm not sure which building that was. I can't remember in Pretty Woman. I saw the film, but I don't remember the apartment. She lived in about 4 or 5 different apartments in Hollywood during her time out here. So it could have been one of those. I'm familiar with all the ones, but I'd have to know the address to tell you if it was or wasn't.
Okay.
But it's possible. Basically, so they're investigating. They're gathering information on her. And the killer starts sending in taunting notes to the police. They're cut and pasted like ransom notes. He's taunting the police and cutting these notes out, and Dahlia killing justified. And then he comes out with another note, turning myself in on February 29th, had my fun at the police, and he signs it Black Dahlia Avenger. And more cut and paste. He cuts out some photographs, says I'll turn myself in for $10,000, yada, yada, and just keeps taunting the police. He sends in about 8 or 10 of these notes. Some are disguised handwriting. Only one note is not disguised, and that's this turning myself in note. So then he also calls up this James Richardson, who I mentioned was the examiner, the editor, and taunts him and says, I'm the killer, and basically says, I understand you're having trouble moving forward on the case. Maybe I can help you out. And Richardson quickly realizes this is the real deal, and this isn't some whack job, that it's actually the killer. So he tries to trace the call, signals kind of for his secretary to trace the phone. And the killer says, you're probably thinking about tracing this call, so I'm going to hang up. But he said, I'll send you a couple of her personal effects before she went, shall we say, missing. And then he hangs up. Sure enough, 2 or 3 days later, Richardson gets these personal effects, and they're her ID, they're 4 or 5 photographs from her purse, their Social Security card, and so basically they're the real deal, and he realizes. Then he continues taunting for about another week or so. Then it kind of goes dead for a while, and nothing really dramatic happens, and it kind of goes off page 1 for a while, and things quiet down. And then a few years go by, and it kind of fades down, and they really make no progress, and it becomes one of LA's most famous whodunits, but remains so because of the absolute horror and the uniqueness of it, of the crime itself. So now let's go back to how I got involved in the investigation. So I'm long retired. I'm 14 years retired from LAPD. I'm doing my PI work up in Bellingham. I get the phone call, go down, do all the things you have to do to take care of a father that's just passed. And June gives me this small book of photographs. It's just
Let me ask you a
3
question,
by 5.
Because there was a lot of members of the family, but everything fell to you to take care of the funeral arrangements and all of the wills and probate and all that kind of stuff.
Well, he was, like I said, for whatever reasons, I had become his favorite son. Go figure. And he wasn't in contact with family. He was a very mysterious man. He was kind of like a man in an iron mask, behind an iron mask, very mysterious, and didn't have contact with any other than me. I was about.
Okay, then wait a minute. Out of 11 kids, he had 11 kids total?
Yeah.
Out of 11 kids, he chose to reconnect and become best buddies with a homicide detective's son.
Yeah, well, as we get into the psychology of George Hodel, I mean, I think he really saw it as part of his own. I think he was. Can you imagine? I grew up and completely unaware of any of this, and became a big city homicide detective, and he considered himself a master criminal, and so basically, I think he was kind of getting off on the taunting and the stuff.
Yeah.
Clearly, he knew that I didn't have a clue. I never suspected anything. I had no knowledge. So I didn't even know I knew that Black Dahlia was a famous unsolved from the 40s, but I was in the 60s, 70s, 80s. I was looking at the present and the future, not the past. I didn't even know her name, Elizabeth Short. So anyway, she gives me the book, and I'm going through it, and there's photographs of my family members, my brothers, my mother, friends, and then there's a picture of a young, attractive, dark-haired woman, nude. And I looked at June and I said, "Who is this?" She looked at it and she says, "I don't know, somebody your father knew from a long time ago." So I'm thinking, why do I know this? It looks familiar to me, this face. Why do I know it? And maybe it was the style of the 40s and stuff. I'm not quite sure why, but Black Dahlia comes to mind. And I had seen a TV film called Who is the Black Dahlia that was made in the 70s. And that might have been the connection. But anyway, it just kind of came in, and I don't know what the source was on it. But then about 5 days later, I'm talking to Tamar, my half-sister, who's living in Hawaii, and we're talking about the great man and his passing and what a remarkable human being he was and how we were all kind of in awe of him. And, you know, there are the people out there that...
Wait, but wasn't she a victim of his... she still loved him?
Yes, and that's not uncommon. You know, I mean, a lot of victims of incest, you know, love the father. You know, that doesn't change. Despite the horror they went through, there's still a part of them that loves the man, you know, and it's very complex. I mean, but she, I mean, there was a part of her that loved him and idolized him like most of his children. So we're talking, and then she says, that comes out of nowhere and says, well, you know, he was a suspect in the Black Dahlia murder. And I said, what are you talking about, Tamar? What are you talking about? And she says, yeah, but he didn't do it. But he said, you know, the police thought he did it back then. And she said, when I was, you know, picked up and placed in custody, the police told me that they thought he was a suspect in the Dahlia murder. And now, Tamar, we'd been that's 50 years we'd known each other, but I'd only had about 10 or 15 minutes conversation with Tamar during that 50 years. She kind of, you know, after the incest and stuff, she kind of spun out and got into drug, sex, rock and roll, went to San Francisco, and I went obviously a different direction.
Right. Wasn't she connected in some ways to the Mamas and the Papas or one of the Phillips kids?
Yeah, her best friend to this day, one of her closest friends, is Michelle Phillips of the Mamas and Papas. So she got into the whole San Francisco scene and all of that, and had three sons, and I went a different direction. So, you know, like I say, we had maybe 10 or 20 minutes talk in 50 years. So there was that. So then I started looking into the crime, which I knew nothing about. And so the photograph was a strong resemblance. I have on my website, I have photos that you can see in comparison to the one. And then I discover, and starting doing the research and investigation on the Black Dahlia, that there was a surgeon that did it. Well, I knew Dad was a surgeon, but there was no way that at that point, back in '99, that I thought that he would have been the killer. I thought, well, this is crazy, but there's no way he could have been. You know, I knew he had his problems and the sex stuff, but there's no way he was an evil murderer. That couldn't be. I loved my father, and but you know, there was a surgeon thing, and then my girlfriend's living in L.A. and she starts sending me up all the headlines from the 1940 newspapers, a whole bunch of them. And one of them has got this huge note on the front page, and it's the note I referred to, handwritten and said, turning myself in on January 29th, had my fun at the police, and signed Black Dahlia Avenger. And I looked at it. It's my father's handwriting.
Wow.
I said, this, and it's the only one that's undisguised. And I said, this can't be. How is this possible? And then I'm thinking, well, maybe he was pretending to be the suspect. Maybe he knew the killer. What's going on here? So, and then, of course, the search, you know, these things all together, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to have to relocate back to L.A. and take a serious look at this. And I was sure that I would be able to, in a year or so, if I follow through, I'd be able to establish that he had nothing to do with any of this. So that's what I did. I packed up and moved back to Los Angeles in '99, and got heavy into the weeds. Started, you know, doing all the things, finding as many witnesses as I could, re-interviewing them. And the more I got into it, the more doors opened, and the more and more it started coming together. You know, his handwriting and witnesses. It was clear that you know, the descriptions, and then I got into the investigation of the crimes, and I discovered, surprisingly, that it wasn't just the one murder, that there was a series. Of course, they didn't have the term serial killer back then, but they called them chain murders. But it was very clear that LAPD was investigating many of these unsolved murders that occurred from 1940 to 1950 as being linked. They were certain they were connected. And
even some other murders, the lipstick murder, you believe, was also connected.
Absolutely. There was
okay. We got a break coming up. We got a break coming up. This is that long break I was telling you about. We'll be back around a minute after 6. We're with Steve Hodel, SteveHodel.com, author of all these books on the Black Dahlia murders. Incredible stuff. Author of Black Dahlia, Avenger, and Most Evil Avenger, a Genesis for Murder, and a Black Dahlia Avenger, a Genius for Murder. A Genius for Murder, not Genesis. Okay, we got Steve Hodel, LAPD homicide detective, 300 closed cases, just incredible information. And he's put together this investigation like a homicide investigation, because he is a homicide investigator. And we're getting some information here that I've never heard before, and we'll be back right after this. Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. We're here on freedomslips.com every Friday night, 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Tonight we have an incredible guest. I want to call him Professor Steve Hodel. You know, I want to give you a title, man. I tell you, I was so impressed with his work. But we got Steve Hodel, former LAPD detective, 300 homicide cases. Steve, just pick up where you left off.
Okay, so basically when getting into the weeds of the investigation, I discovered that there are a whole bunch of unsolved lone woman murders in Los Angeles from 1940 to 1950. There's about 10 heavy-duty ones that I feel that Dad was responsible for, and for a whole bunch of reasons. We don't have time to go into detail each one, but let's just take So 3 weeks after the Black Dahlia murder, a woman is found posed semi-nude on a vacant lot, and the killer has taken a lipstick and written on her nude body an obscenity, F-U, and he signed it BD for Black Dahlia. And this was 3 weeks after the Elizabeth Short Black Dahlia murder, and he's taunting the police, poses the body, stomped to death, not cut in half, but a whole bunch of other things. And basically the newspapers and the police link it and say this is the same killer and stuff. And in the next 7 years, 8 years before Dad split, 3 years before Dad splits, there's about 6 more. And a whole bunch of these have a note, a taunting note left with them or sent in taunting the police. Well, I've had 300 murder investigations, and in 0 of those have I ever had the suspect send in a note. Very unusual, very rare. And in 6 of these 10, he's left a note. So clearly it's a serial killer. And LAPD was investigating it as all connected. That's part of the myth that would later come out. There's 3 myths that I blow up in my books, and one was Elizabeth Short's missing week. There's supposedly she disappeared for a week. That didn't happen. And the second is this myth of a standalone murder, none before, none after. That wasn't true. And the third was LAPD never solved the crime, which is also untrue, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So I have these, I've actually come up with about 20 different murders that are suspicious. So I break them down into categories. Category 1 is what I consider to be definites. Category 2 is possibles or probables, and then 3 is possibles. So I lay them all out, and I put my case together, and I go in secret to the one of the head deputy DAs here in Los Angeles, a guy named Steve Kay. Highly respected, probably one of LA's greatest prosecutors. And he's active, was on the job, and this is in like 2001 now. I go to him in secret, give him all the photographic evidence. I've had question document experts independently look at the handwriting. They've confirmed that many of the notes sent in by the Black Dahlia killer were written and authored by George Hodel. They've had, I gave him a bunch of samples of his handwriting and stuff. All of the witness statements, all of the evidence linking it. And basically he reviews it in secret for about a month. Comes back and says, okay, he says, very, very fascinating. He says, a lot of these murders, I'd say probably there's a lot of smoke and fire, but he says, he says, based on your investigation, I would file 2 counts of murder against George Hodel if he were alive and the witnesses were available. And he'd file on the Elizabeth Short Black Dahlia murder, and he'd file on the Jean French red lipstick murder. He says those two. He says a lot of the others look very suspicious, but he says I have a high, qualifying criteria for filing a case. He says I would file those and I would win them in court in a jury trial. So based on that, I said, okay. Well, I knew I had made my case anyway because that's what I did for a living for 24 years. So with that, I went public with it. The book came out the first book, Black Dahlia Avenger, came out in 2003. A lot of publicity. I was on, Dateline did an hour piece, 48 Hours did an hour piece. A lot of controversy, a lot of people upset and saying, don't mess with my myth, and said, oh, this is a daddy dearest. But the evidence was there, and I knew I'd made the case. So that was in 2003.
Yeah, the credentials are there as well.
Say again?
The credentials are there as well. You would think,
Yeah.
But we trusted you to work on 300 homicide cases. Let's give you the benefit of the doubt on this one as well.
Well, yeah, but what's incredible is that that blasted open. So the book comes out and a lot of controversy, and that blasts open some secret files in the DA's vault that had been hidden away for 60 years. And we get into those files, and they're the Black Dahlia Hodel files. And what we find out is, independent of my investigation, George Hodel was the prime suspect all along by the DA and LAPD. He was the number one suspect. These files were locked away and hidden. And this, of course, Steve Hodel could talk about the case and the evidence for, 25 hours, and it's still Steve Hodel, the son of the killer, claiming this, right?
Right.
But here now you have document transcripts, and what we find out is this. We find out in 1950, in February, starting on February 15th of 1950, the DA, what had happened was the 1949 grand jury took the case away from LAPD. They said, something stinks here. None of these lone woman murders are being solved. We're turning them over for the DA's office to investigate. Now, the DA here is a separate agency from LAPD. There's the city police, and then they're the county prosecutors. So they took it away, and to my knowledge, this has never happened before or since, that they've actually taken a case away from LAPD and turned it over for another jurisdiction to investigate. But that's what they did. And like I say, you've got to understand that there was a lot of corruption. You've got to understand the history of the city. I mean, it put Chicago to shame in some ways. It was very corrupt. Cops were running the vice operations, prostitution, gambling. And basically, we didn't have the mafia out here. We had the cops doing it. They were in charge, and they weren't about to let the mafia take over. So about half the department was corrupt, but the other half was good. So basically, what happened was they gave the case to a Lieutenant Jemison, who was the head of the DA's Bureau of Investigation. And he assigns 18 detectives 24/7 around the clock. And they pick up George Hodel, take him down to the Hall of Justice, and say, we want to talk to you. We understand you knew Elizabeth Short. And while they're talking to him at the Hall of Justice, they break into the Franklin House, this Mayan temple, and put microphones in the walls. Not bugs in the phone, but these are actual hard microphones. They hide them inside the walls. They run a hard line from the basement all the way to Hollywood police station, down into the basement there. They've got 18 detectives assigned 24/7, so two detectives at a time around the clock are sitting there tape recording and listening to live conversations with Dad and his accomplices and friends and whatever.
Run on a hard line? On a hard wire?
Yeah. On a hard wire, they've run it from the house along Pac Bell telephone lines.
Oh, my God.
And
That's a huge job, yeah.
Well, they probably hooked into the existing lines.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And ran it to the station. Anyway, they're sitting there listening and tape recording. And they do this for 40 days, 24/7, around the clock. And let me just read you a few of the statements they get in his conversations. He's talking to a baron. I later identified as a Baron Haringa, who was a close friend of his, and he's saying to him, this is a quote. These are actually the transcripts I'm reading. Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead. And I find out he was investigated by LAPD for suspicion of murdering his secretary 18 months before the Dahlia murder. She overdosed. They believe it was a forced overdose. They were trying to put a case together on him, but he split and went to China for a year, and they couldn't prove anything. But he was a murder suspect before that. And he cops out to that. He says, put a pillow over her head, covered her with a blanket, called Georgia Street Receiving Hospital. She expired at 12:39. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they may have figured it out, killed her. Maybe I did kill my secretary. So that's referring to that his secretary, Ruth Spaulding, earlier. He goes on to say, this is the best payoff I've seen between law enforcement agencies. You don't have the right connections made in the DA's office. Don't confess ever. And we find out later that it looks like there was, as I mentioned, this $15,000 payoff on the trial. He goes on to say, I'm in trouble. Well, he goes on, anyway, she hasn't said that she committed the Black Dahlia murder. They're probably watching me. Do you think we could get some girls to see what they're doing? He talks about performing abortions at his clinic. Well, of course, back then, abortions were illegal, and you went to prison from 3 to 5 years for an abortion. So he comes out to performing a bunch of them at his clinic. And then one of the last ones before it splits is, I'm in trouble. He mentions the Black Dahlia, mentions passport. Police have a picture of me and that girl. I thought I destroyed all of them. And then he's in the wind, and he disappears. He leaves the country. I'm not sure where he went initially, Mexico perhaps, but anyway, he's gone, literally leaving the investigators with their microphones up their walls. So they pull out. He's gone, left the country, and so basically, we've got this independent confirmation, all of these transcripts. But the real smoking gun, and the thing that really sealed it was, you say, well, why did, and actually they were, the DA was this Lieutenant Jemison was about to arrest him, and he split. So basically, but the real smoking gun to all of this occurred on the third day of the transcripts and the stakeout. And have we got enough time to get into this? We've got a few minutes.
Yeah, we've got about 9 minutes.
Oh, okay. So basically, I'm going to read your listeners. I'm going to read from the actual transcript that I was reading once we blasted open the secret vault and got these transcripts. February 18th, 1950, 7:35, Hodel Franklin House bugging tape, spool number 1. At 4:20, a woman asking for operator several times sounded as though she was crying. 4:25, woman asks for operator again, said something not heard to operator. And before this, there also was some mention about her being intoxicated. George Hodel asks her, does your husband know you're here? Have another drink. I'm sure he drugged her because she's sounding very intoxicated. She drops the phone, tries to call an operator. Then there's nothing for a number of hours, and then at 8:20, the officer, detectives write, sounded as though the two men went down steps and entered the basement, began digging. Something was referred to as not a trace. Heard a pipe being hit against an object. A woman screams. More hits. Woman screams again. And it goes silent. So I'm reading this. I'm saying, my God, they've got, at the very least, a serious felony occurring. At the worst, a probable murder. They're listening to it. They're 4 minutes away from the house, and they do nothing.
They're listening to this live.
This is live, yeah. And I'm saying, why aren't they out the door, into their car, over there, and doing a rescue? But they didn't. They took no action. Now, you could come up with a whole bunch of reasons as to why the detectives didn't do anything. It's the third day of a stakeout. They're thinking, well, we don't want to blow our cover. Maybe this is just kinky sex. Maybe, who knows, what's happening, and maybe it's just, who knows? I don't know. I can't justify it, but I know what I would have done, but they didn't. And So then what happens? And then basically it's all quiet, and that's that. And then it goes on for another 37 days of stakeout, and they get these statements. So basically, all I can figure is, and we know that they believed a murder occurred because there are other reports in the investigation in the secret file that shows that they followed up. They got the plumber and said, "Did you see any graves or digging in the basement? Did you see any signs of digging?" This was like 3 or 4 days after this incident, and they put a physical stakeout on and followed that. So clearly they suspected that she was killed and possibly buried at the house. So
do you know who that woman was?
No, we don't know who she is. She was never identified. So basically, fast forward, Dad split. He's left the country. Now, you also have to kind of understand the history of Los Angeles at that very time. At the very time this is all going on, the tape recordings, William H. Parker, Chief Parker, who becomes our greatest police chief, is about to become the next chief. He's literally weeks away from being appointed. And his desire is to get rid of the corruption, get rid of the bad cops, turn the department around, take power, and clean up LAPD. So he, obviously, I think what happened was he and then Chief of Detectives Thad Brown was vying for him. The two were up for the same job. Thad Brown wanted the chief, and it was between the two of them. And it came down to the police commissioners' vote. 5 commissioners, they each had 2 votes. And then this occurred, and I think basically this was the decision that, okay, you know what, let's do this. We need to clean up the department. Chief Brown, these are your guys and stuff, and let's seal this off. Let's put it away for now. We'll come back to it. Let's take power and clean up the department. And but if this comes out now, we won't be able to get power. The city, will be open to lawsuits on all of these different crimes. Hodel is gone. We may be able to get him back. We may be able to find him. We may not. If we bring him back, he may get Jerry Geisler and kick our butt again. We may lose it. He knows a lot about all of the corruption and the power, the movers and shakers. Maybe it's better, kind of a Machiavellian decision. Maybe we just should seal this off for now, lock it away, and come back to it a future time for the good of the city, for the good of ourselves.
Yeah, maybe they gave him the plane ticket to get out of town.
I don't know. But anyway, I'm sure that's what happened. I mean, clearly he had his friends on the inside. There's no question about that, who were tipping him off. So that's what they did, and they locked this away. And basically, Parker and Thad Brown ordered Lieutenant Jemison. They said, return it, give us everything, the original tapes and all of the documents and everything. So Jemison did, but what Jemison did, and he's one of the few that's got a white hat in this story, what he did, unbeknownst to them, was he locked away a second set of books. He copied everything, locked it away, and that's why, otherwise, because LAPD, everything disappeared. The tapes, the transcripts, today's LAPD didn't even know George Hodel was a suspect. So we would have never known any of this, and they would have succeeded in the cover-up, what I call a Dahlia gate, had not this Lieutenant Jemison locked away the second set of books for us.
Yeah, you'd think that would be headline news just in itself. Forget about Steve Hodel and his accusations and his investigation. Just the fact that this file was, 86 for all this time, and that happened. We know that happened.
Yeah, well, this all came out, in the follow-ups in the 48 hours thing. It was dealt with,
right.
And but it's still been, it's been hard to. It's kind of complex, and you have to kind of read all of the books to get the full picture, and that's why I wrote the 3-act play recently. I just came out a few months ago with that, called A Genius for Murder, because that focuses on that 5-year period, and it kind of condenses so you understand exactly what was going on here in LA at the time. And but the kicker is, along with that, we've got the top 4 investigators on LAPD and in the county, all independent of each other over the years, admitted that they solved the case. And I'll read you these direct quotes. We've got Chief Parker telling his personal doctor who contacted me. He said, "We identified the Black Dahlia suspect. He was a doctor. It's not like he was a suspect. We actually identified the Black Dahlia." So that's Parker. And then Thad Brown, Chief of Detectives, says the Black Dahlia case was solved. He was a doctor who lived on Franklin Avenue in Hollywood. He tells that to Jack Webb, who, Dragnet guy, his buddy. So you've got that quote. You've got Jemison. We know who the Black Dahlia killer was. He was a doctor, but we didn't have enough to put him away. Of course, they did have enough to put him away. And then the undersheriff, the number 2 man in the sheriff's department, tells his chief of detectives, quote, "The Black Dahlia case was solved, but it'll never come out. The suspect was a doctor they all knew in Hollywood involved in abortions." So these are all independent of each other and documenting it. So, we've got that. And then that's back then, all original investigators. Then in today's modern days, the chief of detectives, today's LAPD will say, yeah, it's officially unsolved. But the then chief of detectives, Thad Brown's modern day counterpart, reviewed everything and said, go ahead.
Yeah, we got a break. We'll be back with Steve Hodel, LAPD homicide detective. He's written several books about the Black Dahlia murders. He's put together a solid case that his father, Dr. George Hodel, the Black Dahlia murder, and involved in many other homicides. Right back after this. Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. Next week we have Scott Michaels coming on, who is the film director of 6 Degrees of Helter Skelter, and he even has a film he did about the Black Dahlia, part of it in the beginning, called Dearly Departed Tours. And interesting guy. He's coming up next week. We also have coming up Mark Rudd, who was a member of the Weather Underground. And he had to go underground for a few years, turned himself in back in 1977. He went to Cuba. He met Castro. He met Che Guevara. We have coming up Diane Diamond, who did a lot of reporting on the Michael Jackson child molestation cases there back in the 90s, and we're looking forward to having them on. We got a bunch of people coming on. Cynthia McKinney, the former congresswoman, and Cindy Sheehan, who protested against the war there next to Bush. But we got Steve Hodel, LAPD homicide detective, with this incredible story about the Black Dahlia murder. Steve, go ahead.
Okay, Ed. So basically, and it was submitted to Steve Kay, the head DA, and I presented basically a summary to the high brass at LAPD back in 2004, I think it was, 2004, and Chief of Detectives James McMurray was present, heard all of the evidence, and basically came out and ordered his guys at Robbery Homicide to go ahead and clear the case. Basically, in fact, I'll give you a direct quote: unless you find some major holes in Hodel's investigation, go ahead and clear the Black Dahlia case. And that's from the Chief of Detectives, the top cop there. And basically, the guys there knew he was retiring in 6-9 months, and so they basically kind of didn't do anything and said, well, we don't have time right now. He retired, and nothing's been done. And I don't want to get too much into that, but basically it comes down to egos and territoriality. And even though I was a highly respected LAPD homicide detective for many years, it's, petty egos and territoriality, and nobody's going to solve our most famous case without even looking at our, that sort of thing.
Sure.
Anyway, that's a whole political thing by itself. But bottom line is, and then in recent years, a whole bunch more physical evidence. I've actually been able to connect the Franklin house, physical evidence from the Franklin house, to the crime scene, which is pretty dramatic, and if you like, I'll touch on that for a bit and just lay that out. LAPD knew that the crime hadn't been committed at the vacant lot, that the body had been brought there, but they didn't know from where. They figured it must have been a private residence because of the extensive, basically the coroner said that the skilled operation, it's known as a hemicorpectomy, and it can only be done, you can only divide the body by going through the second and third lumbar vertebrae. They knew it had to have been a skilled surgeon, highly trained, and it was so neatly done that even the coroner said, I couldn't do as good a job as this surgeon has done. So they knew it was a surgeon. They knew it had to be done in a place with running water. The body had been washed clean. There was no blood on it. It had been all kinds of torture to it and carefully posed. So they knew it had to be a private residence. So basically, I discovered that Lloyd Wright, the builder of the home, had been contracted by my dad when he went to China in 45 to do some repairs at the house, 46, and do a lot of work and concrete work and repairs and while he was gone and when he came back. So I discovered there was some correspondence between Lloyd Wright and George Hodel at the UCLA Archives, Special Collections. Go there, get the Hodel Wright file, open it up, and here I discover that there are some original receipts. There's letters from my dad to Lloyd Wright, instructions and stuff. But there's actually original receipts, and they list 10 bags of 50-pound bags of cement that were billed in the receipts that were used at the Franklin House. But the kicker is they're dated January 10th, 1947. So they were there and they finished the work there during this so-called missing week, just days before the body was found. So we've got these empty 50-pound cement bags at the Franklin House then. Well, we also know that 50-pound cement bags were used to transport the body from the residence to the crime scene. In other words, not placed inside, but the body was placed on top of these heavy paper bags and transported to the scene, lifted out of the car, probably protecting the seats, lifted out, carried and posed. And the cement bags, empty bags, were left right near the body. And you've got the crime scene photographs showing these cement bags laying right next to the body. And we've got the coroner's testimony that they were used in transporting the body. So this is, I don't have the serial numbers on the cement bags, but we've got them 3 days before the body's found at the Franklin House, and then we've got them at the crime scene right next to the body and used in transporting. So that was pretty dramatic evidence by itself. And then the other thing that happened has to do with last year I was contacted by the Ghost Hunters, which is a fairly popular paranormal show.
Okay.
And they said, we want to, we're going to, I guess, ghost hunt the house, the Franklin House, and we were wondering if you wanted to be involved and, give us some history and stuff on the house and stuff. The producer called me, and I said, thank you, but I'm going to pass. I said, I try and keep an open mind, but I said, as far as the paranormal stuff, I said, I'm not really into things that go bump in the night. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but, I want to keep my
credibility,
investigation objective and scientific. And I said, I don't want to. I've had, astrologers and psychics and stuff, and it's been my experience in my years of investigation that most of them are phonies and charlatans. And I'm not saying they all are, but, I just want to keep it clean. I said, thanks, but I'll pass. And she said, well, we consider ourselves objective, too. She says, in fact, we're getting a cadaver dog and a retired police sergeant to come down and check it out, the house. I said, you are? I said, wait a minute, that's a whole different ballgame. I said, that's genuine, real forensics. I said, well, count me in. I said, if you'll allow me to work, to do a separate investigation, and you can follow around on the camera, and we, do that, I said, then I'm in. They said, deal. So basically, in November last year, I met with this Sergeant Paul Dosty, and he's got a black Labrador named Buster. And I met them in front of the house with the film crew, and the current owner, gave permission to access the basement or wherever inside the house. So I met him for the first time, and I met Buster, and we're down at the street level, and the house goes up. There are stairs up to it. We're actually below the basement level on the street. And Sergeant Dosty says, well, you know, are there any vents that go to the basement? I said, yeah, there are. And he says, well, let's start out here. And he says, I'm going to give Buster the command to search. Now, this is a cadaver dog that's trained to alert only for human remains, not for dead rats, nothing else. He's one of the top in the world. He is, you know, his bona fides are amazing. He's been overseas in the islands and the atolls and found human remains of missing soldiers and just during World War II. It's just an incredible record. Anyway, we're out there, and he gives him the command. Buster takes off, and he goes to the southwest corner of the house, and he alerts. Well, right at a vent, which is right at the basement. I'm kind of blown away, and I thought, wow. So we go inside into the basement, and he alerts at 4 different areas inside the basement, and we would collect soil samples for analysis from that. And, of course, based on what LAPD and the DAs knew, we knew that, you know, there had been an assault and possibly buried bodies in the basement, or if nothing else.
Basement has a dirt floor?
Yeah, it was all dirt, all soil. And it was basically exactly as it was from back in the 40s. I mean, part of the place had been refinished, but the area that he alerted on was all original soil as it was. So we collect the soil samples, and then we do a perimeter search, and Buster alerts to the back in the alley. There's an uphill thing, and he alerts at the base of this uphill slope, which was our back then open in our backyard. And he recovers soil samples from back there. So basically, I'm kind of blown away and amazed by this because, you know, during my years, we did.
Yeah, we're back on. We're back on the air. Okay, let's go. I'm sorry about that, Steve. I lost my internet connection, but we're back.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we sent the soil analysis, the soil samples in for analysis, and there was a snafu situation. We kept getting delays and stuff. So after about 6 months or 9 months, we said, to heck of it, let's go back and get some more. So we went back with this Dr. Arpad Voss, who is one of the leading authorities on cadavers in the world. He's a top-notch forensic anthropologist.
Yeah, I've heard that name before. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he was the star witness on the Casey Anthony case.
Okay, sure. Okay, yeah.
And also he works at the body farm.
Okay.
And you know, huge CV. Anyway, collect new samples from the rear area and stuff, and those are analyzed, and they've just come back. And I just released this information last week, and his report is amazing. It's specific. It's human specific. Okay, the analysis says that it's definitely human specific, and that in his opinion, a body or bodies are or were buried near in or near the property, probably in excess of 40 years ago. And now I guess they break that down by whatever chemicals are present, you know, in the breakdown. So what we've got now is this, you know, leading world authority saying, you know, it's specific for human specific, and what he's doing is corroborating Buster, and Buster's corroborating what LAPD believed, that there were bodies buried in or on the premises.
Yeah, plus there's audio recordings.
Yeah, well, of the assault, yeah.
Yeah, so
exactly.
Then are they going to dig up the basement or what?
No, so I present this I present Dr. Arpad's report to LAPD, the current assigned investigators. That's about 4 months ago. They've done nothing. I don't expect they will do anything. Basically, their position is, now they can't refute my evidence, you know, and so all they can do is say we don't have time to investigate this. We're working on current cases, and basically that's their position. They say we just can't, we don't have the time to invest in this. Well, you know, I don't think that's going to change. I think LAPD and there's a whole bunch of reasons. It's political, and you know, I think they're concerned about if they come out and confirm that I'm right, you know, Then they're saying that their two greatest heroes, and my two greatest heroes, Parker and Thad Brown, maybe were involved in this, and maybe that's throwing some mud on their badges. I don't know, but go figure. Anyway, it's amazing that this soil analysis is actually confirming that. Now, the kicker is that Dr. Arpad Voss and Sergeant Dosty believe, rather than in the basement, they think there's more likelihood that the body or bodies are buried on a level area up from the behind the house. Now, when I was living there as a kid, that was our backyard playground, and you went up the slope and it leveled off. So it's actually on somebody else's property now. It was back then it was all open field. But so I contacted the owner of the property. I did my research and found out that it's actually owned by a fairly well-known actress by the name of Laura Prepon. And she is, I think, Orange is the New Black television series.
Really?
She's an actress
Okay.
in that. She's also an actress in the 70s something. I'm not up on television, but anyway, she's a very attractive young actress. So I contacted her and then contacted her attorney, actually, and said, look, here's the story, and I kind of laid it out to him. I said, we would like permission to go and just take Buster up there and let him rule it in or rule it out, because the doctor feels that this area up here in your backyard is very likely that could be a burial site. And he said, well, let me get back to you in a week. And true to his word, he got back and said, I've run it by her, and we're going to pass. We're not going to give you permission to take the dog up there. And I said, well, it's not invasive. It's not like we want to go digging or anything. We just want to have him put his nose to the ground. Anyway, they said no. And so that's kind of where we're at now. Sadly, I'd like to rule it in or rule it out, but LAPD is not, for a whole bunch of reasons, hasn't decided not to take any action. So, and I think the attorney probably looked at it and said, well, hell, if LAPD isn't going to move on it, why should we? In a way you can, his job is to protect her privacy and stuff. So in a way you can kind of understand it, but it's frustrating. So that was huge confirmation, and like I say, it's all come together now, and we've only really touched on, I don't want to say we've gone into more depth than that, but there's so many more, there's a lot more to it. We haven't even talked about the murder as a fine art, the why of the crimes, and that was Dad's personal madness, was this, it's all tied into surrealism, and it's very extensive, and it explains all of that, and we haven't got time to get into that. Maybe if you like, I can, because we've only got about 8 more minutes, right?
Yeah. Not even that. We get 6 minutes.
6 minutes. So maybe we haven't discussed Zodiac. Now, in Most Evil, that looks at other crimes that Dad did outside of L.A., and it deals with the lipstick murders in Chicago in the mid-'40s, which I believe he did.
Now, wasn't it in Chicago, though, those lipstick murders?
Yeah, in Chicago. And another guy was, a teenager was arrested and convicted and served 64 years and just died in prison. His name was Bill Hirons. But it was a false confession, and clearly, I did all my homework. A number of books have been written about him. He did not do that murder.
But now,
there are a lot of wrong
your dad was in Chicago at that time, though?
Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons. I can't, because the records don't exist, I can't establish him there exactly at that time, but there's a whole bunch of reasons why what happened. One of the victims, a little girl, was kidnapped, and she was surgically bisected, and it was the same operation, a hemicorpectomy. She was surgically divided between the second and third lumbar vertebrae. A skilled surgeon, the coroner in Chicago, said, "This guy is better than me. It had to have been a surgeon." Well, the 17-year-old kid clearly wasn't a surgeon, but there are a whole bunch of reasons why that point to George as being the killer. And incredibly, I would have never even gone there, but what I found out and what started me off on the second book, which is Most Evil, was the fact that Elizabeth Short, now this is in the DA files, she goes back to, she's 6 months before she's murdered, she goes back to Chicago. she starts investigating the lipstick murders. She actually sleeps with a few of the reporters to get information.
Wait, who did? Elizabeth?
And Elizabeth Short is investigating the murders back then in 1946.
Really?
Yeah, really. That's what turned me on to it. And I said, why is she doing this? Well, clearly she must have got some kind of clue or hint that Dad could have been related to those crimes, because why else go back and start investigating them? Well, he's out, he's in China, and she starts doing that. He comes back unexpectedly from China. She starts running, fear of her life, and the next thing we know, a few months later, she's dead. But the kicker is this. Her body is posed, I don't know if you can get this in time, but basically her body is posed, the killer knew where he was going. He went down and he was coming up a street called Degnan, D-E-G-N-A-N, and it goes off to the right, and if you stay to the right, you're on Degnan. If you go to the left, you're on Norton. But it's a coin toss, Well, he went to the left thinking he was on Degnan, poses the body, and then goes home. Okay, so the name of the victim, this little girl that was killed in Chicago, take a guess.
Degnan, I know.
You got it, Degnan.
Yeah.
So this is a part of his taunt. Okay, you're going to expose me and reveal that I'm the killer of Suzanne Degnan. So he posed her body on what he thought was Degnan, and that took me to a Manila murder, where it's a surgical murder, body posed, nude in the 60s, and the killer 8 blocks from where Dad's living. It was a surgical murder just like the others, and he poses it on a street called Zodiac.
Oh, my God.
Said, oh, no.
You got to be kidding me.
No, I'm not kidding you. And I said, oh, no, this can't be. So basically, and I lay it all out in Most Evil. I lay out how it all comes together. And I'm not saying my father was Zodiac. I'm saying, they need to do DNA and check this out, because he needs to go to the top of the list because of a whole bunch of reasons, that all fit together. And it's like, this can't be another huge rabbit hole I'm going into here. But the voice is the same. The taunting notes are the same. The handwriting, Department of Justice, California Department of Justice looked at the handwriting. They can't eliminate George Hodel as being the author, as being Zodiac, and they need more of his lowercase writing, which I don't have. But I'm just saying, we need to do DNA on that. And I make a compelling case. I don't say case solved, unlike the Dahlia case, which is definitely solved. There's no question about that. But Zodiac, and it's just, an incredible story all linked together. He basically reinvented it.
We got to have you back and get into more of these details. Oh, real quick. How can people get a hold of you? What's the best way you like to get a hold of?
My best is emailing steve@stevehodel.com.
Okay, great. stevehodel.com.
Steve@stevehodel.com.
Right. Okay, Steve, thank you very much, man. Okay, this is a great show. You got a ton of information. Hopefully we can have you back maybe in a month or so, and then we'll get into the rest of this. This is incredible stuff.
Okay, guys. You take care. Glad to be with you.
Thank you, brother. Thank you very much. All right, guys, good night. We'll see you next week. We got Scott Michaels coming with the 6 Degrees of Helter Skelter.